Hi, my name is Mark Hage, and welcome to this insight session on YEC11 International A-Level Economics for the June 2024 series. In this event, we'll be focusing on the areas of each paper that perform the weakest. To do this, we'll be looking at the 5 worst performing questions on each of the 2 A-Level papers. By the end of the session, you should have received feedback on the performance of candidates in this May-June 2024 exam series, considered the variation of candidates' performance on different questions, explored why performance varies, and understood the key points from the examiner's report. Firstly, let's look at the grade boundaries and marks needed to achieve each grade. As you can see, we have 2 tables here. To contrast student performance, we'll compare the Summer 2024 series with the Summer 2022 series. This was the first sitting of the A-level. As you can see from the first table, there has been no change from the 2022 grade boundary percentages to the 2024 grade boundary percentages. Student performance has returned, therefore, to pre-pandemic levels. Due to this being the new specification and the effects of COVID, the first June sitting of this A-level specification was June 2022, hence this comparison. The grade boundary marks in the second table are actually given in UMS. The UMS mark, short for Uniform Mark Scale, is a conversion of the raw marks. Raw marks are converted to UMS marks for all modular qualifications. This is because raw mark grade boundaries may change from exam session to exam session to take into account variation in the difficulty of assessments. UMS marks allow us to more easily compare marks between exam sittings, where students can take modular units at different times of year. Here, the 2022 UMS is a better comparison of how students performed than looking at the raw marks for 2022 versus 2024. As you can see from the UMS marks required to achieve each grade, nothing has changed from the 2022 sitting to the current 2024 exam series. On this slide, we're looking at the UMS in terms of percentages for both units, Unit 3, Business Behaviour, and Unit 4, Developments in the Global Economy. As you can see, there is just one table, and for both of these units, the UMS grade required to reach, say, a grade A is exactly the same between 2022 and 2024, i.e. 80% of the marks. Therefore, the UMS has remained static, as we've discussed on the previous slide. You may wish in your centre to actually look at the raw marks and see how students have done in terms of grade boundaries and those marks. So what I've done here is given you an A2 comparison for Unit 3 and Unit 4 between the raw marks required in 2022 to reach various grades and the raw mark required for 2024. Remember, this is just to help you do some analysis of your own students' performance. If we look at a comparison of raw marks between 2022 and 2024 sessions, there has been a slight decrease in grade boundaries for the grades A* and A for both units. Unit 3 has seen an increase in grade boundaries for grades E to B. Unit 4 has seen the opposite effect, that is, a slight decrease in grade boundaries from E to B. Remember to treat these figures with caution, as UMS provides a better comparison of the 2 years of performance. However, it might help for you to look at your own centre's performance to see if one unit's performance is markedly better than the other. This may steer you into where to spend time in terms of trying to gain the most improvements for students. Now let's move on to looking at the 2 A-level units and the 5 worst performing questions for each. For both Unit 3 and Unit 4, they have exactly the same 5 worst performing questions. That's question 8, question 9, question 10, and question 7E and 7E. I've not included the top worst performing questions from multiple choice, as this is more simple for you to actually analyse yourself. However, just as a side note, I do suggest you look at the performance of question 1 on Unit 4 in terms of the multiple choice for your cohort. The statistics show that 37% of candidates on this particular question and unit actually scored 0. So it needs to be looked at with some analysis as to see whether this affected your students or not. If this was included in our worst performing top 5, this particular question will be the 3rd worst performing question on the Unit 4 Summer 2024 paper. So just have a look and see where your students stand with that particular multiple choice question. If there's an issue, obviously address it. If not, then you can leave that. Now let's look at the top 5 worst performing questions on Unit 3. For each question we will look at, I will provide you with similar information. If we look at this question, which is question 7D, we can see in the slide I firstly provide you with the question itself. On the left-hand side below this, I've given you an extract from the mark scheme. And on the right-hand side, there is an extract from a sample response, which you can find in the Principal Examiner's report. Both of these documents are on the Pearson website. For all mark scheme and sample responses, they are simply an extract to give you a flavour of the type of areas credited for each question and an example of technique that normally gains good scores or shows you the weaknesses which you need to actually improve on for students. Finally, I have provided a breakdown of marks for the question and the percentage of students who achieved each mark. So let's look at question 7D, which is what we call a points-based question. This means the examiner awards marks where they see the skill being practiced in the candidate's response. The question requires students to examine the impact of falling costs of production on the profits of Uniqlo using a diagram. Question 7D asks students to examine the likely impact of this reduction on Uniqlo's costs of production on their profits. A correctly drawn diagram showing falling AC and MC would achieve 4 marks. 2 application marks were available for a reference to the case study. Most candidates offered correct diagrams. However, a large number were static and could only achieve 2 out of 4 marks. This question also required evaluation for 2 marks, which means a total mark of 8 was available here. Looking at the table first of the marks achieved and the percentages achieving those marks, the evidence shows just over 20% of students scored less than half marks, and 4.4% failed to score any marks at all. Most candidates offered a cost and revenue diagram, including a correctly drawn diagram showing the initial supernormal profit area and the equilibrium achieved knowledge marks. Further marks were achieved by drawing a fall in both the marginal cost and the average costs, with an increase in supernormal profits. This would achieve the analysis marks available. There were no marks for knowledge or analysis without a diagram. Many candidates were able to include application to the case study. There were 2 marks available for this, and candidates should include 2 separate references. The responses where marks were lost were by simply not labelling diagrams correctly at all. I've included in the mark scheme a copy of the diagram and the way it should be labelled. The evaluation was strong for about a quarter of responses. However, not all students offered evaluation, which is required by the command word examine. Using the case study for evaluation, is where candidates could improve the most on scores. This is a very effective way to ensure high marks are achieved in this question. As I stated before, on the left-hand side is an extract from the mark scheme, and on the right-hand side is an example of a good response. This response was well constructed and starts off by offering 2 correct applications for 2 marks. It then offers a clear, well-labelled diagram, which I've given you a copy of, to achieve 2 marks for the correct original equilibrium supernormal profit area. Then there were 2 marks also awarded for the falling AC and MC and increased supernormal profit area. The evaluation was also awarded 2 marks because the student identified the wage costs as offsetting the falling costs in other parts of the business. So if you want to look at this particular example as a good way of approaching this question, just go to the Principal Examiner's report on the Pearson website. To improve on the style of questions, candidates always need to fully label them with equilibrium points. They then need to ensure the case study is used when discussing the business. The points then need to be developed through 2 to 3 cause and effect statements to show the correct level of analysis and evaluation. If you look at the extract from the student response here, there is very good evidence of a well-developed chain of reasoning analysis using the case study as well as an interpretation of the diagram. The next question we'll look at is question 7E. This question is the first of the levels-based marking questions and requires candidates to include chains of reasoning in both their analysis and evaluation. Levels of response questions are marked holistically by the examiner. This means the whole response is read, bearing in mind the levels of response descriptors. These descriptors cover knowledge, understanding, that's AO1, application of knowledge, understanding, that's AO2, analysis, that's AO3, and finally evaluation, that's AO4. The examiner then decides which description of the skills is the best fit for the response, i.e. is it level 1, 2 or 3 in this style of question. This question required candidates to discuss the likely barriers to entry for a business wishing to enter the global fashion retail market. It was worth 14 marks. To achieve level 3, responses needed strong application and an understanding of barriers to entry. If we look at the actual marks and the percentages of students who gained each mark, the data shows that just over 26% of responses gained less than half marks, with 1.5% of responses or more scoring 0. Only just over 18% of students were able to score the top marks between 10 and 14. This indicates a poor performance in both analysis and perhaps evaluation skills. A number of candidates discussed the level of competition in the market, which did not address the question, therefore gaining no marks. A large number of candidates included several short points. This scattergun approach lacks the development needed for the higher levels, and candidates are encouraged to focus on fewer developed points of analysis. There was also a lack of effective use of the case study, combined with a lack of developing their chains of analysis. If you look at the extract of a student response on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the candidate combines effective use of the case study with a well-developed chain of reasoning. For example, in terms of context, they talk about celebrities such as Alexander Wang. Talk about developed chains of reasoning. What we're looking for is a main point followed by a cause and effect development of that point using some context from the case study. What we really want to see is the student developing that cause and effect point by 3 developments. In order to improve performance on this type of question, candidates need to be reminded simply to focus on 2 points, with a lot of application for a higher level response. Each point should be developed by 3 strands, combined with relevant use of the case study. Evaluation then follows needs to be in a similar structure, but also requires the response to specifically answer the question. Quality here is more important than quantity, in order for responses to display the skills necessary to reach the top level. Better to do 2 points really well than 4 poorly. That covers the Section B worst performing questions. Now we're going to move on to the last 3 worst performing questions on Unit 3, and these are all from Section C. Remember, for Section C, candidates get a choice of 3 essay-style questions and need to actually do 2 of those 3 questions. They are all marked as a levels of response question, as we've discussed previously. In other words, the examiner reads the whole answer and provides a mark based on the best fit into which level the skills are being demonstrated at. Question 8 is our first question. This question demanded an understanding of policies the government could adopt to control a monopoly. To reach a high level, a diagram that showed the impact of the policy needed to be included. A monopoly diagram was not sufficient. I have given in the mark scheme on the left-hand side an example from the actual mark scheme of the type of diagram that will gain credit. Looking at the evidence at the percentages of students who gained each mark, 51% of students attempting this question gained less than half marks, and no student scored 19 or 20 marks. In fact, only about 10% of responses gained a mark higher than 15. Overall, this was the second worst performing question for this unit. Most candidates understood what policies the government could use to control a monopoly. However, many candidates were unable to provide a detailed analysis of how they worked. Analysis was often superficial and not well developed, and candidates often provided statements of the impact of the policy instead of analysing how the impact occurred. In weaker responses, reasons were poorly explained and often generic. Candidates using the significance or the level of fine/price cap often provided these as generic points and therefore only reached level 1. Many candidates' evaluations also lacked examples and were only supported by partially developed chains of reasoning. This type of answer could only achieve level 2. The chains of reasoning were a key area of weakness on this question, as was the use of evidence to back up points. On the slide in the extract, you can see an excellent example of a paragraph from an essay. Remember, these can be obtained from the principal examiner's report. This case provides an excellent example of how to integrate the context into their answer. It also shows a point that is well developed in terms of a chain of reasoning. Remember, we're looking for a main point which is developed 3 times. The extract from the student's response provides a clear structure where the candidate explains, for example, the issues that Google causes. They then go on to clearly identify how the government may intervene to stop the inefficiencies. Throughout this response, there is excellent context that is well linked to the analysis. Looking at the wider response, which you can find in the principal examiner's report, the evaluation is strong and shows critical analysis of the issues raised. This is a template to embed with the students and use to help them improve their responses. In order to get better student responses on this style of question, firstly, students should identify the key areas of the question that it's asking them to consider. Once they've done this, they need to come up with a couple of policies the government could adopt to control monopolies. They then need to discuss each of these in turn using a logical structure. Remember, quality is more important than quantity in order for responses to display the skills necessary to reach level 4 descriptors. As I've said before, it's better to do too well than poorly. If students adopt this approach, the examiner then has to consider the full range of levels rather than limiting the student's response to a low level. Develop points of analysis and evaluation should be 3 cause and effect sentences with appropriate context. Evaluation must also critique the responses analysis and offer a judgment based on answering the question. The next question that performed poorly was question 9. Question 9 requires students to evaluate the possible reasons for wage differentials within an occupation. This was the least popular of the 3 essays available in section C and scored the lowest mean mark. If we look at the table of scores compared to percentage of students achieving those scores, we can see the evidence shows that the average score on this question was 37%, with over 79% of students scoring less than half marks. Most responses gained a score of 5, 6, 7 or 8. About 19% of responses gained marks higher than 9, and unfortunately no student scored 18, 19 or 20 on this question. To achieve a level 3 for knowledge application analysis, students needed to include an appropriate diagram. Many, unfortunately, did not provide this, which limited the score they could achieve. Carefully read the question. Students didn't do this on this question. Many candidates addressed why wage differentials exist between the industries rather than within one. However, many candidates also focus too heavily on the reasons why wage differential exists between occupations. This again didn't address the question. As a result, few candidates achieved level 4 on this essay. For evaluation, students needed to give reasons why these differentials may not exist, and some were able to explore the significance of the reasons they had provided. However, the evaluation for many responses was very limited on this question, and very few candidates were able to reach level 2 or above. Most candidates simply listed reasons without development, and very few candidates provided any context. That's any particular examples. If we look above, I again provided an extract from a response that shows a diagram together with a point that's been developed using chains of reasoning. This particular paragraph hits the level 3 skills required. This candidate has successfully focused on one industry using the STEM. However, the candidate would have benefited from addressing fewer points and focusing on developing those fewer points. I've not put the evaluation in here, but the evaluation that this candidate undertook was simply a list and not developed, and therefore this only ended up achieving level 1. In order to get better student responses in this style of question, firstly, students should identify the key areas of the question that they need to focus on. Interpretation of the question is critical. A good mechanism to try and get students to understand the question is to get them to rewrite it in their own words. This shows any misunderstandings which you can then clear up in class. Particularly with a question like this, a detailed diagram is also required that's clear and accurate, and appropriately needs to include the specific labelling, or else marks are likely to be on the lower side. Once this is done, students also need to write each point in turn using a logical structure. Again, quality is much more important than quantity in responses. What we're looking for is students to well develop chains of reasoning so we can actually evidence the skills that lead to level 4 descriptors. In terms of evaluation, we need to practice students again critiquing their own response and offering a judgment based on answering the question. This also needs to be well-developed chains of reasoning. This leads us on to the final worst performing question of Unit 3. The final question in this 5 worst performing questions on this unit was question 10. This question required candidates to evaluate the likely impact of collusion on businesses and consumers. Candidates required to include a game theory diagram to support their answer. If we look at the marks and the percentage of students that gained each mark on this question, we can see evidence shows that over 56% of responses gained below half marks, and most responses were in the range of 6 to 11 marks. About 14% of responses managed to gain higher than 13 marks. To achieve a level 4 in this question, candidate responses need to refer to game theory with a diagram and reference the impacts to both consumers and producers in their answers. The reverse argument could be used for knowledge, application, understanding, or evaluation. Most candidates on this question were able to explain how companies Leicester City Football Club and JD Sport could benefit from collusion, and a large number of candidates included the STEM reference in their answer. Candidates who were able to develop their chains of reasoning in context often achieved high level 3 or level 4. A number of candidates still provided multiple short analysis points, and because these weren't developed chains of reasoning, they only achieved level 2. There was therefore a lack of well-developed chains of reasoning on many student responses. A number of students were drawing inaccurate diagrams and muddled the levels of revenue that needed to be identified in each quadrant. Candidates must ensure they are confident when explaining game theory through the use of a diagram. If we look at the student response, again remember this can be shown in full if you look at the principal examiner's report. This extract shows a 2-stage chain of reasoning, and therefore it lacks the complete development that we are looking for in order for students to achieve level 3. The context, however, here is provided, though it's not fully integrated into the student's analysis of the situation. As is the common theme with question 8, 9 and 10 here, it's a good strategy for student responses to focus on fewer points, and with those fewer points to have much more detailed development of each point. The evidence also needs to be more frequently used, and these need to be embedded in those chains of reasoning. Students also need to try and explain the links between cause and consequences to provide greater detailed analysis, and this way they can achieve higher levels, ultimately level 4. A good technique to use in classes is to take this response here from the principal examiner's report, get students to decide which level it actually falls into, discuss why this particular response is weak and achieves level 2, and then get students to actually go and improve the response in order for it to achieve level 3 or level 4. That concludes the Unit 3 5 worst performing questions. We're now going to go on and have a look at Unit 4. Now we have looked at Unit 3 and its 5 worst performing questions. Let's move on to Unit 4 and again look at the top 5 worst performing questions for this unit. As with Unit 1, we start with question 7, and in this case question 7D. This question, remember, is on section B, and with section B, students have access to a case study. The question asks students to examine 2 likely problems for the Indonesian economy of its dependence on commodities. Evaluation here on an 8-mark question gained 2 marks for explaining each benefit. Question 7D is a points-based question. What this means is it reads through the student's response and awards the marks for all the different skills such as knowledge and understanding at the point that they are evidenced. If we now look at the table with the marks 0 to 8 and the percentages of students achieving those scores, over 30% of students in question D failed to score higher than half marks, with 4.2% of those students actually scoring 0. The average score for students on this question was 69%. Weaker responses simply copied from the case study, which stopped the creation of developed analysis and therefore scored little or no marks. Many other responses failed to write any points in terms of development and therefore gained no marks for evaluation. If we now have a look at the extract from the sample response, remember you can see the full response in the principal examiner's report if you wish to read this further and or use it with students to help enhance their performance. The extract from the sample response can be seen here, and it actually shows you a student who has used evidence with speech marks. If students struggle to actually remember to use particular evidence, one technique to encourage with those style of students is to actually use speech marks in the responses so that they know and the examiner knows that this is being drawn from the case study. Here we can see the candidate has used those speech marks, which is an acceptable approach to use context. However, just a point of note, the marks are given for how this context is used in order to develop the analysis or evaluation rather than just for its inclusion. So just be careful of students that think by just cutting and pasting some context in a response is sufficient to gain credit. Unfortunately for them, this is not the case. It's how that context is used. Remember, we're looking for students to actually do developed chains of reasoning. What that means in a question like this is each of the 2 likely problems need to have a main point and then a cause and effect logical structure for the development of that point, which is actually, say, 3 sentences. So each of those 2 likely problems should be developed 3 times. Also, context needs to be integrated and therefore what we're looking at is a 6-sentence approach for both of those likely problems. In order to improve responses, candidates need to include 2 pieces of relevant data and use this in their developed analysis and evaluation. This data needs to be taken from the context. It might be a good idea, if students are struggling with this, to use a writing frame to help embed this technique. The points need to be developed through 2 to 3 cause and effect statements to show the correct level of analysis and evaluation. If we look at the student extract here, you can see that the student response in this paragraph shows very good evidence of well-developed chains of reasoning, and the student has actually used the information from the case study and integrated it into their answer. The next worst performing question on Unit 4 was in Section B. This question was question 7E. This question was a 14-mark question. The question asked students to use the source to discuss market strategies the Indonesian government might use to increase its rate of economic growth. The question was looking for two strategies, and this needed to be the focus with well-developed chains of reasoning. This question was a levels of response question. So remember, with a levels of response question, the examiner reads the student's full response and then, thinking about the skills required in each level descriptor, puts the student's response into the best fit level. So if the examiner believes the students practice the skills for level 3, then that's where the response goes in terms of the mark. That's the starting point. Looking at the evidence, if you look at the mark table and the percentage of candidates achieving those marks, the evidence from the marks achieved by students shows that 10.6% of responses scored 0 on this question. This was the worst performing question on this unit in this respect. The average score on this question was 58%, which is the equivalent of a high D. 39.2% of responses scored less than half marks, and just over 18% scored higher than 10 marks. Development of analysis on this question needed to show cause and effect with 3 developments of each point to achieve level 3. Often responses copied paragraphs from the case study. This achieved no marks. There was then no analysis and no chains of reasoning, again achieving no marks. Other responses adopted a scattergun approach, covering as many strategies as possible, but without any actual development. This achieved very few marks. Evaluators failed to answer the question, but tended to give solutions to the problems instead. These style of responses that mentioned interventionist strategies, for instance, gained no marks for this approach. If we look at the sample mark scheme on the left-hand side of the slide, we can see that each point makes use of specific evidence from the case study, and it's this style of integration of context, knowledge and understanding and analysis that gains the most credit, particularly the logical development of points with a chain of reasoning. If we look on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see an extract from a student response. Remember, the full response is available from the principal examiner's report. This particular extract shows the student's evaluation of their answer. The reason I've included this is to make a particular point, which you may also like to develop with your students. The analysis of this particular question, which is not shown here, was well developed. Again, just go to the principal examiner's report and you'll be able to find the full response there. If you look at the evaluation extract here, you can see that it's poorly developed. You can see the evaluation here did not have 3 chains of reasoning to gain the top level. It actually had poor chains of reasoning and therefore gained lower credit. A good strategy to help students develop their analysis skills on this question would be to firstly get them to write only the analysis arguments in an answer. Once they've done this, then get them to compare this with the analysis of this sample response and look for any improvements. Once this has been done, students can then decide what level of evaluation should be awarded looking at this particular evaluation in the sample response. You can then discuss the actual level this evaluates out the issues why the actual evaluation needs to be improved. Once students understand this, they can then actually rewrite or enhance the evaluation to achieve the top level. Overall, students need to improve the development of chains of reasoning on this question and focus on 2 strategies using context in order to gain high marks. In order to get better student responses, firstly, students should identify the 2 strategies they wish to discuss, rather than superficially discussing as many as they can think of. Once they've found the 2 strategies, they then need to discuss each strategy in turn using a logical structure in their answer. If it helps, students can put headings for each strategy. This is quite acceptable in terms of the examination. Remember, quality is more important than quantity in order for responses to display the skills necessary to reach the high-level descriptors. Let's now move on to the next 3 questions that were the worst performing on Unit 4. All 3 of these questions were in Section C. Remember, for Section C, the candidates get 3 questions to choose from, and they must choose 2 of those 3 questions to answer. The questions take the form of an essay-style question, and they are all worth 20 marks. For all 3 questions, the students' weaknesses had similar. Students failed to use context in terms of the issues discussed. A lot of the responses lacked the development of chains of reasoning. Remember, we're looking for a main point which is developed 3 times to gain higher marks. And many responses made very short points instead. Remember, students are supposed to have a high level of awareness of various countries in order to form the basis of their arguments and therefore achieve the highest levels in their answers. Also seemed to be an issue, regardless of which question students attempted. Let's look at question 8 first. This question asks candidates to evaluate policies that can be used to prevent a country's exchange rate from depreciating. Students needed to use a developed country of their choice in order to act as the context for their answer. If you look at the marks, 0 to 20, we can see the percentage of students who achieved each mark. The evidence here shows that this was the second worst performing question on the paper, with the average mark being 46%. 74% of responses achieved less than half marks. Also, just over 5% of responses achieved 15 marks or more, and no students achieved 19 or 20 marks. Reasons for poor performance here were many. The first reason may have been that for level 4 responses, students should have referred to a developed country, with many responses failing to do this. Next, chains of reasoning were not developed by 3 or more points. Therefore, even better answers were only getting to level 2. Other responses focused on the effects of depreciation, which failed to answer the question and therefore gained no marks at all. Other responses gave many policies but failed to develop their points with context or chains of reasoning, gained no more than level 1. Evaluation was often just a list, or only explained 1 point in detail. Again, this only practiced skills that could be awarded level 1. In order to gain student improvement on this style of question, they should not write in bullet points but in paragraphs, with each paragraph containing a separate point. For example, a benefit of a policy to a country's exchange rate may be the focus of. Responses should then develop the 2 points with 3 chains of reasoning at least, and the use of specific context from their chosen country for analysis. The context from the developed country should be integrated into the response to provide a coherent discussion. In terms of evaluation, the evaluation should also be developed by 3 points, with further use of context from their chosen country to answer the question. What we're specifically looking for is students to discuss, having done the analysis, which may be the best policy out of the 2 discussed in order to prevent depreciation, and why this is their preferred choice. If we look at the sample response on the right-hand side here, the student practices the process that we're looking for. In other words, what we're after here is the student to give a main point and then to develop that through a chain of reasoning by at least 3 points in a logical format. The student in this response also includes contextual examples which are based on their chosen developed country. This is an example of a high-level response and may be a good format for you to talk through with students. So one approach might be to actually give students this sample and discuss why it practices all the correct skills, and then let them have a go at another policy to actually practice the skills themselves. Let's move on to the penultimate question, which is question 9. Question 9 was actually the worst performing question on this unit. The question asked students to evaluate the cost to a country of becoming a member of an economic and monetary union. The question again was a levels of response style question. So again, the examiner was reading the question holistically and deciding which skills best fit the student's response and placing the response in that level. If we firstly look at the marks and the percentage of students gaining those marks, we can see that the evidence shows that the average score on this question was 37%. If we think back to our discussions on the grade boundaries, 37% in 2024 actually equates to a U. So a lot of students were not able to gain a mark sufficient to pass on this question. Almost 50% of responses of this question scored less than half marks, and no candidates were able to score full marks here. Finally, only just 9% of students scored 15 or more marks. So we can see here how this particular question has underperformed quite considerably. Some responses confused monetary and economic union and therefore scored few marks. Therefore, the first area of improvement for candidates, if your candidates fall into this category, is to re-emphasize the student's knowledge and understanding on what a member of an economic and monetary union means and what the differences are. A specific country that students are familiar with to do this should help make this process tangible. Students also need to be reminded that the use of examples from their country of choice needs to be referred to in their answer throughout the whole of the answer in order to access level 4. Chains of reasoning were also there, but were often undeveloped. Remember, what we're looking for in terms of well-developed chains of reasoning is a main point followed by 3 cause and effect points in order to achieve the top level. The writing structure of students' responses on this question also needed to be improved. To further embed this, it's possible to practice perhaps using writing frames. Alternatively, chains were developed by students but weren't always logical, often omitted analytical points. Activities that encourage students to review their responses, or even just one paragraph here, should help students to refine their developments of chains of reasoning and spot themselves where there's an omission between a cause and effect link. In terms of evaluation, the evaluation was often poorly written and often didn't answer the question. Those students that did attempt to answer the question generally gave very generic points with no chains of reasoning. This often only gained level 1. The extract on the sample response you can see on the screen here on the right hand side shows a template for candidates to write a developed chain of reasoning for this style of question. A good technique in class might be that students could be talked through why this is a good sample of a response in achieving higher levels, and then you give them another cost to the country and they then try and practice skills using this particular sample as a template. Remember, they need to be reminded that when they're writing their developed chains of reasoning, they need to ensure there's sufficient context from their country of choice here. That where the examiner has more than 2 points to consider, they will just credit the best 2. Therefore, candidates should only discuss 2 points and focus on creating chains of reasoning that are logical and have at least 3 developments to each of those points. The points should also have relevant examples from their chosen country in order to reach level 4. For evaluation, 2 points need to be explained again using the same chains of reasoning approach already discussed. This time, the response should specifically answer the question as to whether or not the benefits of being a member in terms of economic and monetary union outweigh the costs. This finally leads us to the last of our 5 worst performing questions on Unit 4. The final worst performing question was question 10. The question asked candidates to evaluate possible causes of an increase in public expenditure as a proportion of GDP. Again, to gain access to level 4, responses needed to refer to a chosen country. If we look at the marks and the percentages of students gaining those marks, evidence shows that this was the 3rd worst performing question on the paper. In fact, the optional 20-mark question were the top 3 worst performing questions on the paper. The average score here on this question was 46%, and over 72% of responses scored less than half marks. As you can see from the actual data, no response actually gained full marks, and only 5% of responses managed to score more than 15 marks. Thinking about the quality of responses, some responses had a chain of reasoning, however, they used the incorrect terminology and application, and therefore gained no credit. Other responses had a similar issue with the development of chains of reasoning by 3 logical cause and effect arguments using relevant examples from their candidate's chosen country. Where this approach was omitted, it acted as a barrier to achieving high-level marks. Evaluation was also generally poor, with some responses giving general points on the effects of an increase in public expenditure rather than relating this to GDP. This approach gained no credit at all. The evaluation on the causes of an increase in public expenditure on GDP is not explaining those effects. It's the causes that have to be evaluated. The extract, as we can see in this sample response, shows a template for candidates to write a developed chain of reasoning. Remember, this full response can be obtained by going to the Pearson website and looking at the principal examiner's report. Once students have been talked through why this particular part of the response is a good example of the skills being practiced, students can then be given another course on an increase and be asked to use this as a template to write their own paragraph showing a developed chain of reasoning. And remember to embed the fact that they need to include relevant context from the economy of their choice. In order to get better student response on this style of question, students should identify their two causes they intend to discuss and put these as headings in their response. They then should discuss each in turn and use a logical structure to develop their arguments. Quality is much more important than quantity in order for responses to display the skills necessary to reach level 4 descriptors. It's much better for students to do 2 well-developed chains of reasoning than many stunted points. Remember, we're looking for students to do a main point and then develop that point at least 3 times. Students also need to integrate into their response their chosen economy and examples from it. That brings us to the end of both units for this insight session. So we've looked at the underperforming questions, and now we're going to have a look at some further information. A good tip at this point is for you to have a look at your own cohort performance and prioritize the questions which you found those performers. You can then look at the analysis of that question in this presentation and then use some of the strategies suggested to gain improvements in student performance. Now we've covered the worst performing questions on each unit, what now follows is a summary of the key areas centres should focus on in terms of improvements according to the principal examiner of each unit. We will then look at the resources and support available from Pearson to help you in enhancing student performance further. Firstly, let's look at Unit 3, Business Behaviour. The principal examiner suggested that longer answer questions require more depth than breadth. Candidates should aim to develop 2 detailed analysis points and 2 detailed evaluations to achieve the higher levels. For Section C, diagrams should be drawn where helpful, and many students successfully incorporated cost-revenue diagrams into their responses. Stronger responses utilize their diagram to explain the impacts on a business or different economic agents. Students that did best were able to apply to the specific question and use relevant examples that fitted with the context provided. Longer answer questions require depth more than breadth. Candidates should aim to develop 2 detailed analysis points again and 2 detailed evaluations to achieve higher levels. Analysis and evaluation needs to be well developed in order to achieve higher marks on essay questions. For Unit 4, Developments in the Global Economy, the principal examiner has suggested that candidates must read all questions carefully and make sure they've addressed all parts of the question. Drawings should be appropriate, accurate and legible with the correct labelling. An extract should be used as evidence in responses rather than copied out in order to achieve higher marks. For longer answer questions, they require depth more than breadth. Candidates should aim to develop 2 detailed analysis points and 2 detailed evaluations to achieve the higher levels. Analysis and evaluation needs to be well developed to achieve higher marks on essay questions with 3 points of logical cause and effect arguments. Finally, students should be encouraged to practice challenging skills such as analysis and evaluation through the use of previous exam paper questions. That brings us to the end of the look specifically at Unit 3 and 4 issues. You should now have received feedback on the performance of candidates in the June 2024 exam series, considered the variation of candidates' performance on different questions, explored why performance varies, and understood the key points from the examiner's report. What follows next is a guide to the support provided by Pearson to help you improve performance in your centre. Now we've completed looking at all the exam series for 2024, let's have a brief look at the resources that Pearson's made available to help support you in the forthcoming year. This slide shows the resources and course materials available for this particular syllabus. As you can see, there are many different exemplar materials available, and what I've done in the slide is provide a link to those materials for your future reference. There are also comprehensive lists of all past exam papers since the specification started. I've given you an example on this slide. I've also given you a link which you just need to click on the slide and it'll take you to the appropriate page on the Pearson website. Pearson also provides a set of very detailed analytical tools you can use by accessing their website. The next couple of slides goes through those tools. Firstly, we have what's called the Pearson portal, and I've provided a link to the website where you can access this. As you can see from the screenshot, there are various different things that you can access. I've highlighted two of them. One is called the Exam Wizard. This is where you can actually create from past papers your own bespoke papers to use with students in terms of examinations and testing. The second is something called Results Plus. What this does is it actually gives you access to statistics and details about your students' performance. So there's two analytical tools there which you really should be accessing in order to help enhance student performance. There's just a little bit more detail here I've given you just to show you what Results Plus is. As you can see, it shows you a number of different things you can use in order to actually look at your students' examination results. The first one's highlighted, as you can see, and under that it says Analysis Reports on your Edexcel examinations. So this is something I would highly recommend you having a look at and utilising in order to tease out the key areas and questions that your students on the summer 2024 series did best at and or worst at. This way you can focus your actual teaching on the things that need the most improvement. On this particular page, you can see Results Plus. We've clicked on Analysis Options, and as you can see, you can actually look at your student results in various different ways, and also you can download those once you've had a look at them. The one that's highlighted here, for example, is Cohort Results. Finally, I've given you a link to resources and news, and again, this can be really useful in terms of things that are currently happening in the subject. If you click on that link, it will take you to the page where you can see things like Professional Development Academy, latest news announcements, and obviously training that's available for the subject. I'd explore this, and hopefully this will provide you with further support in terms of courses and any other issues that are concerning you about the subject. That brings us to the end of this insight session. I hope you've enjoyed it. Hopefully it's helped you in terms of focusing your students for the current academic year. You have now received feedback on the performance of candidates in the May-June 2024 exam series, considered the variations of candidates' performance on the top 5 underperforming questions on each paper, explored why this performance varies, and finally understood the key points and recommendations from the examiner's reports.